Hey, the concept for this interview began when I was reading the introduction to a book called The Chinese Typewriter and found it so compelling that I had a holy shit moment where I needed to know more, not just about the ideas in that introduction, but also about the person who was incubating those ideas and how he understood his work. So, this episode turned out to have a little less exposition about the Chinese typewriter and its sequel, the Chinese computer, than I'd planned for. That said, I think this conversation was a really fascinating interrogation of the themes in these books and a great dive into how Tom Mullaney thinks and works. This is the Gradient Podcast. I'm Daniel Bashir. The best way you can help me out with this project is by sharing it with people you know and by leaving ratings and feedback. And now, without further ado, Tom Mullaney. I was kind of bandying about for a way to start this episode. And where I think I actually want to begin is about 14 years ago. And I was, as one does when you're about to interview somebody, sort of Googling around for your name. When I typed Thomas Mullaney into YouTube, one of the videos that came up was an interview you did with the Stanford Humanities Department about 14 years ago called In Your Own Words. And this appears to be when you were pretty early on in the project. Do you remember that interview at all?
I don't. It's one of those, I don't know if I remember it or I remember the memory of it, but I know the video you're talking about. Yes, I think I was in my first year or second year at Stanford at the time. Or something like, or I forget, maybe year three. Yeah, somewhere I was assistant professor. I know that.
It seemed pretty early in the project. And I guess I wanted to start here because you said something towards the end that really interested me. There's a portion, one of the last questions you got was after you explained a bit about how you came to start working on this project of investigating the history of the Chinese typewriter. And I think this was the very last question that was posed to you. It was, why are you working on this project? And at the time, your answer was, I don't know. And you had some further thoughts that were also really interesting to me about this comfort you'd cultivated with not knowing why you were doing this. I have multiple questions about that. I guess I was surprised to hear you say that. I guess I'm curious how you think about these different levels. I have like the obvious question, but maybe the first question I have is how you think about these levels of abstraction where when you're doing a project like this, you're telling a story with the project about the Chinese typewriter, but then you're also, as an academic, somebody who has to tell a kind of higher level story about the project you're doing and your relationship to it. And so I'm curious how you think about and relate to a question like that why question.
That's a great question. Yes, when you write a book, when you make a film, uh, when you start a business, I think there are many long-term projects that all fall under the bucket umbrella of what I'm about to say. You do have to develop two narratives simultaneously, all while not losing focus of the truth. So one is just the narrative of the book. So it starts on word one, it ends on word whatever, 125,000. Then there is the narrative that of the story we tell of the process, and I'm not being poetic here. I mean, applying for grant applications, applying for submitting abstracts to conferences about works in progress. And that's the narration of the process, which often involves justification, legitimation in professional terms. And then there is the third story, which is the one that in that interview, I don't know why I did this, but just the honest, more interior story and truth of one's research process, which entails naivete, immaturity, uncertainty, flat out just gut instinct, which every researcher, every filmmaker, every artist, will be honest, is a fundamental part. There is no one I have ever met who has fallen in love with a project who knew why from the beginning. It is the same. It is, I don't know, the same biochemistry as falling in love with another human being. There is no one who is love struck who in that moment can put it into words and get it right. And yet you're love struck, so some part of you knows. Some part of you has the full answer to this and the complete certainty. But that's the incredible thing about love, is that it doesn't require us to understand it to work. And the same thing is true when you're in pursuit of something. But the difference is, in human love, you're not applying for grants. You're not applying for travel grants to go see the love of your life again, or go on a date, or it's in many parts of life that love is allowed to unfold, and sometimes it goes unsaid for an entire lifetime, or unexplained for an entire lifetime. But in research, our professional endeavors are, they require this storytelling, and you're not allowed to write to a grant agency and say, please give me money for this. Why? I don't know. You're just not allowed to say that. You have to dress it up, make it sound smart, put it in the appropriate terms, or the appropriate literature, the appropriate vocabulary. And it is theater, and it is a lie. It is fundamentally a lie, but it ends up being, well, I'll say it can end up being a theoretically and intellectually productive theater, because sometimes in your heart of hearts, or you suspect in your heart of hearts, that you're just BSing sometimes to get the grant. But then your BS machine can produce a sentence, and suddenly you realize, wait a minute, these other three sentences are just me trying to get the grant. This one, I think I've hit upon something. I think I am starting to put into words why I am in love. And then that is a guide, both to the rest of the research journey, but it also goes right into your writing. It goes into the introduction of the book, or or something about the film, or whatever it might be. And so, yeah, that's what that answer was. That's why in that interview, I decided to say, I suppose I really don't know, um, and then just let the chips fall where they may.
You sound really clear-eyed to me about what the grand process to theater is and isn't, and how that relates to this kind of ineffable love of your project that you have. And I'm wondering if that's something you had to cultivate. I'm curious if in other academics you ever see this risk of the actor on the stage becoming, what the person thinks they really are.
That's exactly the risk. Exactly the risk is the actor on the stage coming to think that's who they are, forgetting that it's a mask, that it's a performance. And I am not. Let me just be very, very pragmatic. I I never have advised anyone to go running screaming into the street. I mean, I don't, unless someone has a sort of messiah complex and wants to end up on the cross, and they think that's what it's all about, and that's then there's I would I think that sometimes we understand the relationship between authenticity and inauthenticity incorrectly. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes to truly transform the world around us, we have to be an inauthentic version of ourselves in order to move forward, in order to inspire, in order to organize, in order to make sense of things. And that sometimes just to run screaming into the street with the blunt, unvarnished truth of our is an incredibly egocentric act that serves no one but the ego, and more 99.9 repeating percent of the time does not start the revolution that one in one's feverish egocentric dreams believes. And so it is the same. It sounds, coming back to writing books, nonfiction works of history in academia, or I don't know, studies of just coming back to the far less dramatic world of academic research, it sounds as if it's very different. That like we're not trying to change the world, but we are. All researchers are engaged in an act of venturing, tiptoeing into an absolute void of nothingness. It is the job of researchers, wherever they are, to sit right at the absolute end of the void of knowledge and sort of peak the curve of their retina over that border and incrementally sort of move into that. And it is, and in order to do that, well, first of all, to do that is to incrementally or sometimes radically change the world, because if you change our understanding of the world, you have in some real way changed the world. But in order to do that, you have to keep the lights in your lab on, and you have to keep your body healthy, and you have to, buy diapers for your kids, and you need to find after school care, and you need to, so, and all of those things do engage us with the world as it is and all of its wonders and brutalities and so forth. And so it really is this question that, okay, I feel this rawness and this authenticity, and so now I've got to put on this mask or go into this. And is this a violation of that? Is this an abandonment of that? And I think that the key question, coming back to the way you put it, was it's only an abandonment if I forget or lose sight of the theater of this. If you do lose sight, if the mask adheres to the flesh, and then and all one becomes is a performative grant writer, or a performative literature reviewer, or a performative, name dropper, vocabulary, terminology expert, etc., then something has happened that can become at some point in one's career beyond the point of no return. And so it's a simple act of saying, it's a simple act of having at least one confidant, one very close friend, someone who is a cone of silence. And you yourself can be a cone of silence, but it's good to have a sounding board who you can turn to and say, I think what I have no idea. First of all, they'd be able to say, I have no idea why I love this so much, or I suspect I really don't like what I'm doing. The other side of it, and then to be able to say, to work out in words what is the nature of that love, um, because like I'm an historian of China, I will tell you point blank that none of my love for any of my subjects has to do with China. Like I could have very easily ended up studying an entirely different part of the world, entirely different time period, maybe a different discipline, although I do think there are sensibilities of history that actually are more fundamental to me. Um, but if I'm going to find the reason for my nearly ineffable attraction for a particular topic, it's not, the word China is not going to show up in that description. But again, if I have, there's the performative side of me that has to make it about what I do. I am a biochemist because, I'm a cancer biologist because, I'm an historian of China because, and China and cancer better be in those descriptions if I'm going to be legible to the world at large. But if I'm talking to my confidant, I can be honest that I think this is why, and maybe not. And it's a process. It's a process of working that out. And as long as you have that process, then I think the inauthenticity is palatable, tolerable, and actually you start to understand that it is part. It's two sides of the same coin. In some sense, there's nothing disgusting about it. There's nothing gross about it. It's the way that I often tell anyone who asks me about this is I say that a goal in this career, and probably any career, is that you need to create a persona, and you could redesign it over time and change it, but you have to create a persona that doesn't feel unbearably inauthentic to yourself. Unbearable. because that's torture, that's hell, that's something that people are thrown into for a number of different reasons. Um, but it's not a question of ha- having to put on a mask or not put on a mask, or have a persona or not have a persona. That's not available. It is to craft and refine and adjust a persona that when you step into it and walk out into it, uh, you don't feel a trillion miles away from home. And I think that is we're not trained to do that. There's no class on Persona 101, but there kind of should be. There kind of should be. I don't know what the curriculum would be, but there kind of should be.
Did you ever figure it out? The ineffable, not necessarily including the word China version of why you had to do this history?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I eventually, um, well, I have sort of figured out in my own words, where it comes from, and how how maybe I would put the problem of it. Yeah, that it took. Let's see, how long did that take? 10 years, but I finished the first book in the process. So that's the cool thing about research. It's the same thing about love. It's like it doesn't require your knowledge of it to work, as long as there are other mechanisms by which one can be sincere to their love without beyond articulating it. There are many parts of life that if you can't say the answer, you don't know the answer, right? But love is not one of them. You can know it and not be able to say it, and so for example, my first book, my dissertation that became my first book, I figured out what that was about either a week before I submitted my dissertation or even after I got my job at Stanford. Like I've been working on it for 7, 8 years, and then I was like, okay, okay, yeah, I got it, I got it, and it it's there. You can't. Someone who doesn't know the story of that can't necessarily see it easily, but as soon as I would explain it to someone, they'd be like, "Ah, yeah, I got it. That's there. That's there." And uh, and then for typewriter, actually, I mean, it's Chinese typewriter, Chinese computer. We're all, that used to be. It's now 2 books. One came out in 2017. The other one's coming out in May of 2024. It used to be one book. And then at some point, I decided to split them up into two. So collectively, though, it's been about 16 years working on that. And I would say I sort of figured out maybe around year 8 or 9 of the process, I started to have a strong suspicion as to what this was all about.
Would you be open to sharing what that suspicion was?
Um, yeah, sure. I mean, so I've always been fascinated, disturbed by world making, um, and I later in the process learned a term that was very useful for me from Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr of convergence. That humans have this bizarre ability, and maybe other sentient organisms too, I don't know, to transform the world around us to fit the descriptive models we create of them. Sometimes, so we can shoot the arrow and then draw the target around the arrow in some weird way, which is very, very weird to me. I mean, maybe it's not anymore, but I think it was. I think it was weird to me. And my first book was effectively a story of incredibly effective world making, one of the largest and most successful social engineering projects in human history, which is the ethnic classification project in China, which I wrote about in that dissertation and book. Um, and the typewriter and computer, a lot of people have said to me, "Wow, that's so different. Like you left behind this other thing and you moved into this new. And for a time, I kind of believed them. I was like, yeah, I guess I did. And why would I do that? And that was kind of interesting or risky from a career standpoint, whatever. And I realized actually, no, there's a total continuity. It's not a continuity of case, it's a continuity of problem, but there is new, but with new facets to it. So in typewriter, we also have a story of world making, but in this case, it is, and it's an incredibly successful one. That is the making of a world from the 19th century onward that is the world of technological language. It is communication and information transfer and etc. So from Morse code, electric typewriting, telegraphy to the present day. And this is a story of world makers like Remington Corporation and IBM and Olivetti and Mergenthaler Linotype and processes of world making that, much like my first book, involve forms of violence, and not always or necessarily physical violence, but epistemic violence. So in the case of the classification, quite literally, you had Chinese social scientists come to the state and say, we think that these groups, despite the fact that they don't want to be merged, can and should be merged, and we leave it to you to do that through the instruments of statecraft. Not like genocide, but education systems and propaganda. And we basically, what they, at the end of my first book, if you put it this way, is that a group of social scientists handed blueprints to the state and said, we think you could make this world. This is not a picture of the world or a drawing of the world. It's like a state of potential that is empirically backed. And here, it's a guide to world making. Uh, and the same thing was true, the same forms of violence were true when Remington took over the world. So some writing systems were really easy to absorb into this particular technolinguistic model of the keyboard-based, the shift-based, single-shift keyboard-based machine, etc. French was easy, and Russian was easy. Hebrew was easy. And then Hebrew was a little harder because it was, a different writing direction, right to left. Arabic was a little bit harder because of connected script. Korean was much harder because of the way that the writing system, the components of the writing system assembled and so forth. So, and they set about with these almost casual violence, this casual Euro-American violence of, well, let's just cut this particular letter out of the Burmese alphabet, and people don't use it, and that way we can fit it on the machine. And so there was this process of world making that nearly absorbed the entire world with one massive residual category, which was Chinese script, which is a pretty sizable category. And so one would think that the world making process collapsed or failed. I mean, that's a pretty big missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle, but it didn't. It's still with us. It's in front of us as we speak on our laptops. And so that was the place, I guess, in the research where the notion of world making was still there from the dissertation and the book into typewriter and computer, but now with this notion of an incompleteness to the world making, this persistent, resistant element of, and the question of why and how and what next, and then the story is centered on this particular device, which started at all my concern with Chinese typewriters, as this idea that a Chinese typewriter is simultaneously something that historically existed. I have one there. I've donated ones to Stanford. I've seen them. They physically exist in the world, and yet, by all accounts, they should not have ever been able to exist. They're this sort of impossible object, a keyboard with no typewriter, a keyboard, a typewriter for a non-alphabetic script, all these sorts of seeming paradoxes, and that here we are. It's here. It's there. And I think my concern, that was probably a new dimension of a problem um, that bridged the first and second book in my career. And then the third book, Chinese Computer, is um, a different bridge altogether. It's basically the bridge from everything I've just described to an entirely new domain of concern. It's like a continental bridge from one continental plate to another, the continental plate being problems with uh, disappearance. It's that one's a little bit long-winded, so I'll kick it back to you. But this is just to say that you, I'll use a metaphor or an analogy, perhaps a stretch of an analogy to describe how I understand the weird process by which anyone is doing any sort of long form work, whether it's a graphic artist again or a researcher or someone who's just what it what it what is the process of understanding how their problems are changing over time. And it comes from this conversation I had with someone, a world leading researcher on saccadic eye movements. So the way that our eyes are constantly jittering around, trying to have new focal points and so forth. That every single time our eyes saccade multiple times a second in micro ways, and every time it saccades, effectively you go blind. Like you're no longer processing thing in that point. And that's interesting enough, and it's basically the brain is stitching it all together and giving us a feeling of continuity. Cool. But it's even weirder than that, which is that every single time you saccade, your brain kind of doesn't really know what it's going to look like when your eye rests again. It has to make a guess effectively. And it needs to sort of use the microsecond time of literally the electrical pulses being fired through our nervous system and the sort of cognitive processes of deciding where to go and all this sort of, it literally has to sort of prepare for that next fixation. But it's not as simple as imagining like a photographer standing in, on the ground trying to figure out where the next action shot in the soccer match they're watching is going to be. Like it's just them on stable Cartesian ground pointing their camera to get the shot, instead the whole grid is moving. There is no Cartesian grid that is just stable. We are in cognition. We are moving, or as this colleague put it, smearing the grid constantly. So the whole XYZ complex of our cells is constantly being repositioned and then stitched together over and over and over again. And so when a scholar is in between or feels their problem drifting, we're trying to make calculations on our trajectories of thought on the deck of a ship, so to speak. It's an unstable place that we're trying to figure out what. But in hindsight, I'm pretty sure that my first book, Ethnic Classification, Coming to Terms with the Nation, Ethnic Classification in Modern China, book one, The Chinese Typewriter History, there was a very clear bridge between them, but something was also changing along the way. And that also the relationship of the Chinese Typewriter History and then the new book, The Chinese Computer, A Global History of the Information Age, there's something drifting there as well. And already I know that I'm drifting in very different directions. So that drift is, I think it's really exciting, but it's also it's terrifying because there is a moment when you kind of have to start all over again. People have asked me like, "Oh, is there going to be someone asks me, is there a sequel to this or is there a sequel to that?" And this is the performative side. Sorry, someone just decided to start an engine out my window. Um, there is a performative side to it, which is, wow, I probably should just write the sequel to this. Probably should, because everyone knows it. They'll buy it. I'm a subject expert in it. I don't have to I don't have to start everything up again. I know the field. I'm respected in the field. So everything is pushing us towards a continuity of case. a continuity of topic. But you can wake up one day on sequel 4 or 5 of the same topic and feel a trillion miles away from home because the ground under your feet has shifted.
It sounds like projecting forward what you were saying earlier. And I also want to flag that disappearance is a really interesting word you used earlier that I want to come back to later in this conversation. But what was interesting to me about the way you spoke about this, the world building bridge, the bridge between the typewriter and the computer, that one's maybe a little bit more clear to the rest of the world. But kind of going forward with what you're saying, should I do another sequel in this kind of Chinese typewriter series, if we want to call it that? Do you feel like if you woke up and found yourself on a totally different continent and maybe the next book you write is going to be totally different, do you think that there's going to be a kind of internal continuity for you, even if you don't know it yet, that just might not be legible to the rest of the world?
Yes, I do think, and I don't know if this is an article of faith or if it is, I kind of think it's empirically so, but I do think that um, there is a pre-given continuity or a pre-given coherence at some level. I don't know what it is. I don't know if this means I believe in the self at some sort of deeper fundamental way, but maybe I do. I've never really asked the question actually, which is very bizarre. Um, do I believe in a self?
Do you believe in a self?
Let's say let's say I do, just for the first branch of this ramification. Um, and you know, there's reason to. I have anecdotal feelings to say that I do, which is I'm a father, and I know that there are dispositions from birth. There really, really are. There is no explaining. You know, there are conditional factors for explaining temper and humor and introversion. Actually, there are certainly things of that upbringing and situations and so forth, but there are some things which are inexplicable as to like what's up. Um, I don't think it's a linear system. I don't think there's a self that in any linear way expresses itself into the world. I definitely don't think that. Um, but some kernel that in some weird nonlinear way has a pre-causal root cause kind of manifestation that then bounce and ricochets itself into a manifesting person. I don't know. I mean, I think it's funny because I remember it, and I won't embarrass anyone by naming names, but I remember taking class with one of the world's leading feminist scholars who completely deconstructed concepts of race and gender, and then brought her undergraduate class to apartment just for like at the end of class, and made a passing joke of, you know, I didn't believe in the essentialism of any until I had a kid, and like all of us were like felt betrayed.
I would
You
feel
know,
that
like,
too.
you know, I mean, it was said in humor, it was said in jest, but I do think that and I don't think that the person burned their arguments and their arguments don't hold, but I think that um, I suspect that I'm a person who believes in the existence of a self, but who argues that methodologically we should pretend as if we don't believe it. Because nothing good methodologically can come from believing that exists. It can, if you announce that the self exists, in my view, it can only lead towards sloppy simplification and economization. And so even if it does exist methodologically, it is better that we all agree that it doesn't. And that we fight to the last soldier on the field using self as an explanatory mechanism, if that makes sense. Like until after exhausting everything else that would help us understand why something is as it is, uh, that the last possible causal empirical thing would be there's the self, there is some essence here. Like I think that's the key, is that methodologically anti-essentialism is the only logical choice, even if you suspect that there could be a kernel of essence. Because, um, I do think that at some level, uh, the the in the case of one's journey through figuring out, like, why do I want to do this and not that? Do I want to spend, 16 years working on what I originally thought was going to be one book about Chinese typewriters? Is like, but it was not a question, which is amazing and weird to think. But you know, uh, I I think that all of the soldiers are done, and the last causal explanation is yes, there is something that has all the makings and looks a whole lot like a tiny little pixel that is somehow stable. Um, there is a center. There is a center. Maybe that's another way to put it. Is which gets us away from the idea of self is center, which is, everything has a center. You take an irregular weird object and you can do that cool exercise to figure out, like, where is its center of gravity. You know, like, I don't know if there's a shape that doesn't have a center of gravity, but maybe that's the cool thing the Hungarian mathematician learned about. But it's maybe that's the way to put it. Is because of That's an interesting question. Yeah, that takes that might resolve the problem of there being a, because there's always the homunculus problem of, like, the being and the being, and then it's just this infinite regress. This is just to say that, um, how is it possible to have such incredible clarity and paired with complete inarticulateness at the same time? That's very, very, very strange. It requires explanation. But that's how research, and I use that word very broadly, that's what research proves to be true. Um, and so I don't think it makes any sense, and I've never witnessed it, where, take anyone, a filmmaker, a musician, an artist, a choreographer, a fiction writer, a cook, a chef. I've never met someone, or see from afar, let's say, where it's like one of their works and another one of their works, it looks as if they're made by completely different people, like utterly completely different people. Um, there does seem to be a continuity, and yes, it could, maybe it's explained that, but it's by the same two people, so your brain is doing the job of, figuring out a connection between the two of them. It's still in the eye of the beholder, and that might be true from the viewer, but I'm talking about from the perspective of the person making it. And I don't think that that is explicable. Just that, that's just one of the many things that we make, that we as human organisms just make into a continuous experience out of a discontinuity. The fundamental I do believe in the fundamental discontinuity of existence, and that basically continuity is where the work takes place, and discontinuity is just given to us. Um, and I do think that that happens all the time. Like, take a CV. Every time you apply for a job, and go for a job interview, you have to totally rewrite everything in your entire life to be as if, oh, this is the moment I've been waiting for. Please give me the job. You don't walk into an interview and be like, this is one of 10 things I've considered. So will you hire me? Uh, and Ian Hacking talks about it as well, as, the in making up people, when this notion that, I don't know, someone in midlife can identify then from that point on as gay, and then can rewrite all of these earlier human experiences in their life as foreshadowing, or, I do think that there is a process where we as humans are continuity machines, and we don't like this discontinuity. We don't like incoherence. So we spend an incredible amount of our cognitive energy, maybe all of it, more or less, on that process. But that is not the same thing as saying there is no um, there is no pre-given continuity or pre-given kernel of coherence. And I can't yet give. I'm not able to give up on that yet. I'm trying to give up on it, but I'm not sure that because there's the clarity. It comes from the clarity of love, the clarity of disgust, the clarity of allergy, the clarity of magnetism, the clarity of, in the absence of an explanatory model, even close to an explanatory model. And so that's when whenever I have students who, this doesn't necessarily resolve their worries, and I feel bad for that, but I do have students or, people that talk about their research, they worry about being scattered. I worry about that all the time too. And I do invite them to an article of faith which is, you know, being unable to articulate what you're doing is not is par for the course. So that's fine. Don't worry about that. That's true even while you're doing it. But two is, and again, this kind of, I guess it has to be an article of faith, is if you are lit up by this, and if you are lit up by this, and if you are bored by this and bored by this, there is a coherence to that. It might not be obvious what it is, but there is a shape to that. It is not random. Um, I do not believe there can be a randomness to those forms of clarity. I do think there can be a randomness to when we do the mind games. Someone asks you, "Are you interested in X?" And the answer is in your brain. What answer could I give that would make me safe in this conversation or make this person think? Then things get all game theory, very quickly. But the clarity of the ethnic classification project in 1954, a group of social scientists went to Yunnan and categorized the ethnic minorities there. Clarity, absolute piercing clarity out of many other potential topics I was sort of thinking about. Um, Blueprints for the first blueprint I saw of, U.S. patent document for a Chinese typewriter. Boom. And so, what categorization of ethnic minorities and blueprints for Chinese typewriters? Um, there is a coherence to that.
Some of what you were saying about the self reminded me of something that I think we tend to encounter in like college metaphysics courses about projective theories or regulative principles, where we can inhabit this space of using the language that accepts the existence of something like a self, but in our actual metaphysics, being able to acknowledge that there isn't really one. And so it's almost like you're an anti-realist about something, but you can make sense somehow of the realist position. I think this is kind of what Blackburn got into a lot. But that also reminded me of something in your introduction to the Chinese typewriter. You told the story of this encounter between Chinese script and the International Olympic Committee in 2008. And the particular interesting point here is how this kind of uncovered these false alphabetic universalisms. And that kind of reminded me of something that I'd read in McLuhan when I was like trying to be one of those cool kids who had read McLuhan. And the thing that struck me so much about it, the false alphabetic universalisms, was he also kind of had this idea. And I wrote down this quotation from him because I wanted to make sure I remember it. He said, "In Western literate society, it is still plausible and acceptable to say that something follows from something, as if there were some cause at work that makes such a sequence." And he also says that neither Hume nor Kant detected the hidden cause of our Western bias towards sequence as logic in the all pervasive technology of the alphabet. And that's a really interesting point that I think you were also trying to destabilize as well. But I'm curious how you think about a quotation like that, if that's something that feels right to you, and how you think about this.
Yeah, so that you thank you for doing your work on this. I really admire and appreciate it. Um, I mean, that gets back to the the relationship between the first and second book of classification and typewriter, which is um, so. I can start from the Olympics because I think the Olympics anecdote was the place where I first was fully able to put into some situation uh, the thing that really disturbs me. False universalism freaks me out. It freaks me out because it's not that it doesn't freak me out as a first principle because of epistemic violence. It freaks me out because it works, and that scares me because so so we have this document, we have the Olympic Charter, which aspires to this Catholic universalism and has the phrase I forget what I wrote. It's in the books. It's kind of I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to remember, but it's that the opening ceremony, the Parade of Nations, will take place alphabetically in accordance with the alphabet of the home nation. So again, it's trying to be very universal. If you're Russian, will be by the Cyrillic alphabet. If it's in I don't know if it's in Cairo, then it's going to be Egyptian, Arabic, whatever it might be. It sounds like it's very neutral and universal. And then we have this writing. We have the 2008 Olympics. Uh, the same disturbance is actually in the first book, but I never wrote about it, or I didn't elaborate on it. It's sort of sitting there, which was, um, I would tell as soon as I would tell people what I'm working on. I'm working on the early Chinese communist state, categorizing and deciding which groups to recognize and which not. And everyone thought my book was going to be about, you found more, right? You have found people who have been silenced, you have that have been absorbed. So they're 56 officially, but there's 60, or there's 100, or that there are. And isn't it terrifying that there are 40 more than that which exists? That is not what terrifies me. What terrifies me was the first, and I do write about this. I don't sort of harp on it, but it took me a while to realize I care a lot about it. Is that the early communist state? Their initial idea was we are not going to get in the business of classifying people. Everyone classify themselves. It was like one of the most radically, liberal anarchist acts. It was anarchist taxonomy, and it completely failed. It completely and utterly failed. You had respondents on the census who had no idea what question they were being asked, but gave an answer. You had multiple completely different epistemes at work in the answer, uh, meaning people fully understood the question they were being asked and fully gave a sincere answer to it, but they were operating in completely different epistemic frames. And then all of that stuff gets bundled into the final list, which, if it had been followed to the letter, would have broken the Chinese government from the moment of its birth. It would have just broken the Congress. And then it's at that point that the state says, "Oh gosh, I guess we need to do this the way that other states do this. Let me call in the social scientists." And then the social scientists walk in and say, "We already know the answer to this question. We've been working on it even without you guys for about 30 years. But yeah, we'll do the sort of a final run. So send us there, and we'll take it from here." Um, and the the terror of it was, can there exist a world without taxonomy? Because if there can't, um, then the most we can aspire to is being an additional box on a census. That's it. That's equality. That's liberation. That's freedom. That is the escape of That's it, is to be a box, to be part of the allocation of resources and access to goods and things. And if uh, if it if it can, um, meaning like if there is if it is imaginable uh, to have a world in which this very brief experiment with anarchist self categorization could exist, there is no one, to my knowledge, who has ever articulated what the structure of such a world would possibly look like. It certainly doesn't look like any state that has ever, at any scale, and maybe there are smaller scale communities I don't, at any scale that has ever existed, that that is the necessary circuitry, let's say, of such a system. I mean, even in the 21st century, even the articulation of, even in one of the, we were living through one of the periods of the most sort of radical attempts to shatter at gender categories and fluid categories. It's still, there's still a drop down menu for all of it. There's still a drop down menu in Facebook or whatever for all of it. It is still, taxonomy can capture. The question is what does a world look like in which the circuitry of it is built in such a way in which it is truly anarchically taxonomic or anti-taxonomic, ataxonomic. Um, that's that was actually the probably the moment in the book that really got me, because that, I mean, I've talked about this in other contexts. I wrote that book because of the terror and fear of being a high schooler and realizing that there was not a single persona I could see, including my own, that was not a store-bought persona. You could go to the store and buy an anarchist jacket, like, or you could just get tools. Or even if you did do it all on your own, you still ended up looking like the thing that was in the Gap window. Like there was no form of identification or form of identity that wasn't an identification with a form that was already pretty well mapped out or rapidly captured. You know, maybe it exists for a fleeting second as something that had not yet been captured, and then it's captured. You know, I talked to media theorists, and they're like, "Tom, duh, this is just the story of this is media, basically." It's like, yeah, but it bothers me. Yeah, if so, great. I mean, if you can sleep at night with that, then I am having trouble. And so the classification was literally a way for me to slow down. I don't like watching horror movies because they just freak me out for like forever. But so writing a dissertation about this was like watching Nightmare on Elm Street one frame per week, which suddenly makes it possible for me to look at the horror in really, really, really slow motion, um, to try to understand it, see where the pathways are diverging, see if there is like if there are other worlds are possible. How does it, to see it in incredible slow motion, because at regular speed, it seems completely insurmountable, inescapable. And so that's the same dimension that we have now, but it's not a world in which it's not a world of identity categories or census categories where it is the world of how we understand the very basics of the digital writing, effectively writing in the digital age, which is the world that we inhabit on a daily basis is such a tiny fraction of this sort of expanse of possibility. It's such a collapsed space of technolinguistic imagination, and yet we understand it to be the whole world. The whole world is this, and so then it became interesting to say, no, it's not. I had found, unlike the first book, where I could not find a world without taxonomy. I never succeeded in that. And in fact, places where people saying I do live a world without taxonomy say, no, you don't. No, no, you don't. You've just added categories to the Excel doc. You're still living in an Excel doc, though. And so that dissertation was like, I didn't find it. Then in the second book, the typewriter, it's wait a minute. Here is a zone that the grid, this new grid forming from the 19th century, is like desperately trying to bring into Excel and can't. Without rewriting the program of Excel, we can't import this file into our grid. It doesn't work. And so what the grid did was, I'm anthropomorphizing here, heap scorn on the data set it could not absorb. It's horrible, it's backwards, it's incompatible, it's a joke. I mean, racialized, it's everything in order to just preserve the logic of the grid. And it never absorbed the grid. Not it never absorbed this data set. And then lots of different agents, historical agents, operating in this zone of just began thinking and like inhabiting and being and just residing in this place and thinking and trying. And most of the story, I was telling this to a friend of mine, you know, it's a very crazy story to read. A typewriter is like this and computer is like this. It's failure, 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 global success. Like, multi-trillion-dollar industry with unicorns coming. And so, um, and had and has actually built a world in which this alternative exists, but the alternative is still ensphered by the grid. It isn't governed completely by the grid, but it has not made a global grid of its own. It is not. It's not an alternate grid, like I mean, an alternative modernity that is being attempting to be sold out there. It still does exist within kind of Latin alphabetic global dominance, which is still alive and well, but it has created this interior sphere inside that, which is now arguably the majority of global population. More people compute the way that China computes than the way that an Anglophone computer user in New York computes, at least in terms of human computer interaction. Um, and then there was this moment in which the one moment in which I maybe found a place where taxonomy broke. Um, Coming back to the first book, it bothered me that I never found a place. It bothered me because I think what I had said to myself was, I I'm not going to say that there are no places where taxonomy doesn't exist. That doesn't make any sense. I That's like a claim of omniscience. All I'm going to say is I have never seen any large scale infrastructure made by an organization or an institution or a community that does not abide by taxonomy. I've never seen a global. People didn't go to the moon based upon a gridless system. They didn't build, you know, New York City without a grid. They don't. Modern medicine, the way we understand it, sort of non-invasive, you know, outpatient cancer stuff is not is it's so this terror, this horror in me was like, well, there's something disturbing about the grid, but there doesn't seem to be or appear to be anything that can be done at any scale without it. And then I went to Sagrada Familia in Barcelona one time, just like a tourist. I was there for a conference or a visiting scholarship at a institution, and I had a day off, and I went there. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's been described as a Gothic a Gothic cathedral that someone put on the bottom of the ocean for 3 centuries or like 300 years and then brought up. It's I don't know how to describe it. It really does seem like it was built by termites, like those sort of. There are, to my knowledge, I few if any right angles. It it is so breathtakingly impossible that I just began to sob because I knew I was wrong. Um, the person, it's a little bit of a trick though, and it's actually similar to the Chinese typewriter story, which is it was built with grids, but it was built with grids, in my view, to kind of destroy the grid. The grid had been the guns of the gunboat, the grid had been turned on itself in some way, and it was like the sense of which, in theory, and I don't know enough about it, and maybe if I studied it for longer, I'd find that it's all an illusion and it's wrong. But there is this ongoing question of whether or not the master's tools could be used to dismantle the master's house, etc. Um, I think primary formulation is no. The answer is no. That's something about wielding the tool. And I'm not so, and I kind of had just given up hope that outside of like small pockets of little organization and, you know, okay, if we go back to the Taoist notion of peace, where peace is, what is it? Peace is hearing a cock crow in the village a few miles away, but never having set foot there. That's peace. Which, if yes, that's peace. It's not a peace I necessarily want to live in, though. I don't. That doesn't appeal to me. My peace would be where you can hear the cock crow. Maybe you go visit your cousin, but you don't then engage in forms of grid organization and try and repeat the story of human carnage. Um, and so, is there a framework for larger forms of organization that are in some way ungrid-like? Is and when I was in that cathedral, which is one of the most towering, most as a structure, it's just so strange and breathtaking. And being like, okay, maybe I sort of gave up too soon on that possibility, and that's always when I feel very very sad, moved, not sad, but moved um, is when you realize you have. To use a metaphor from extinction conservation biology, you've called off the search for the animal you think is extinct, because that's the moment of extinction. Actually, technically speaking, extinction is also a taxonomic thing. It is not the death of the last animal. It is when you have decided we're not looking for it anymore. There is a weird relationality to it, and we declare extinction all the time. Family relations that will never be repaired, human relations that will never be repaired, friendships that will never be rebuilt, po- possible worlds that, because you have never seen any evidence at all of their possibility, you just call off the search. And then years and years and years and years and years later, you can suddenly see a little animal cross the street and be like, oh my gosh, there it is. And you just, this is joy and an utter sadness that you had just declared that extinct, gone, impossible. Um, that's what happened when I was in there. Uh, and I don't think that my relationship with research, obviously, this is not how people talk at academic conferences, but I do not, but it is how people think. And that's the only thing. Uh, every researcher I have ever met who has been doing this for even a modest amount of time knows exactly what I'm talking about. I might be very florid and blah 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 in my language, but the spirit of what I'm saying is totally just like what everybody is doing. It's research is extremely existentially personal, uh, even for someone studying chemical pathways and viruses and things. I'm serious. It's there's something amazingly personal about this, and I think it makes you a better. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyway, I'll just pause there.
I'm wondering if there's a way to put the experience you just described of seeing this sort of building and being able to recover your belief in the existence of this other world as something almost an analogy to the path of experiencing this ineffable love that you talked about earlier, and then somehow having to use the tools available to you to pursue your project in order to maybe put that into words, and maybe not as if, crossing into a completely different chasm of consciousness, but it it almost feels like what you were, I don't know if this is right, but what you were trying to say to me, it felt like, was something almost like kicking the ladder. And I guess I used this phrase to describe this, a Wittgenstein phrase. I've probably quoted this story to people a million times, but one of the early thinkers who sprouted the German idealist movement was this guy Jacobi, who was writing some letters critical of Moses Mendelssohn, and everybody at the time believed that if you were to apply demonstrative philosophy in the best way possible, you got to Spinoza's monism. And that monism left no room for something like free will. And this was so immediately intolerable to Jacobi that he then commits this sort of mortal leap, he calls it, out of demonstrative philosophy. He thinks that's not the way to do things. But there's a way you can kind of read him as he's constructing an argument. He's using demonstrative philosophy to get to a conclusion that is then against itself. He's going against the very method he used to get to his conclusion. And a lot of what you were just saying to me felt like something very similar at heart. I don't know if that reads right to you.
Yeah, I mean, you're venturing into. I appreciate this, and I will. I have to confess ignorance on. I won't be able to use your terms back to you, but I think that's okay because that's just
Sure.
the nature of it. So recently, I had vertigo for a month and a half, and I probably will come back. I've heard, and it's it's just mercifully, it seems to be just a mechanical issue, meaning not like something that's more worrisome, knock on wood, but it's freaky. Apparently this like, very tiny biocrystals can fall out of where they should be inside the inner ear, and which is how we governs our sense of self and proprioception, et cetera. And it kind of just falls out. It's just like, and then it just begins to whoosh around in places it's not supposed to be. And when it does that, your brain just cannot make sense of where it is in space and overcompensates. It does all sorts of things, and the experience of it is the room spinning, or or a general, even when when it's not acute, it's just this general wobbliness. It wasn't fun. I don't wish it upon anyone. I do know a technique to get rid of it now. It's not mine. It's apparently if you ever get asked to do it, it really does work. But I kind of spent I had to spend some time thinking inside it, and it's almost like instant required non-self-identification technique. The room is not spinning, and the room is spinning, and because ideally it's happening in reasonable situations, like you're lying down in bed or whatever. It's not like you're under attack and you need to like literally figure out like where to put your shield to get the arrows from hitting you. It's not. So you have space to sort of sit and play inside this very weird moment of two completely competing truths. And what I'm in a circuitous way of getting at here is I think vertigo is a permanent condition, regardless of whether or not the room's spinning. And so we are in this very weird position of knowing that we don't know all the time. And so let me venture into a much more pragmatic place. Okay. A beginning writer, an immature writer that all writers are at some point, can often think that the perfection of writing is something about a kind of perfect transference, that it's about implanting the right image in the mind of the imagination in order to like put things together into a sequence, etc. So it's authoritative. It is the very notion of being the author, like, and better and worst writing is the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the imagery implanted. And very quickly, meaning 10 years or so into the process of trying to become a better writer, you realize, oh my gosh, like I've been doing this wrong the whole time because I'm leaving all the money on the table of all of the cognition of all of the potential viewers and readers of this work. I'm doing nothing. I'm not harnessing anything in the world around me. I'm trying to do it all myself. And the place where I saw this put most explicitly was in the incredible series of works like How Comics Work, about graphic novels, and the sort of theorization of them, and the notion of narrative closure. So obviously that terminology doesn't come from the realm of graphic arts, but he's using it very. I think it's McLeod is using it very expressly, saying, okay, if you have a comic book artist has so little to work with, has like 7 frames or 2 frames, or you know that if they ever fell victim to that kind of immaturity of authorship, they would just fail. And instead, they know explicitly that really everything that's happening and everything they will be credited with as the author and brilliant author and artist of is happening in the gutters between the frames. You're just creating these sort of traps of closure in which you, as the author and the artist, are making one thing, which is literally loaded into a printing press and duplicates are made, but you've built it in such a way that you have actually written a potentially infinite series of narratives, because any viewer, any reader will bring their full cognitive equipment, all of their backstory, all of their fears and hopes and desires and loves and attractions and everything, and they will deploy them into all of those gutters between the frames. And what writing is gutter design. It's gutter design. It's space. It's absence design, not stuff design. Stuff is the thing to make the absences, to set the traps that then allow a viewer to sort of populate it and make something, um, the most beautiful thing they've ever seen, the most horrifying thing they've ever seen. Because you cannot show me the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. I have to be the one to supply that. So you need to create the condition in which I populate it with the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. And so this is like, but then we're back into the artist studio. Like, you have to have the mindset of, wow, I know a lot, and I mostly don't know a lot. And out of this, I'm going to sort of try to set the conditions for this phenomenon to take place that I will never witness, and has a truth to it. And it's that, um, it's that. And so it's an unstable configuration. It's not a. I will never know if maybe I guess if my book sales go up, but I have no eyes on that. I will never ever know. And most of those populations and of these gutters will never be documented. Someone will just put the book down in horror, and that will be it. It'll make some sort of neurochemical signature, but that's it. There's no. And um, I think we can actually have that sort of relationship with the real, or whatever we want to like, uh, as well. And so I don't think it's something as simple as the sort of the erosion of the self, the realization of the forms, whatever sort of different spiritual paths, because it's that the simplest way is that this is we are n-dimensional beings operating in a greater than n-dimensional space, and we it doesn't we don't even need it to be unreal or real, or all we need is the dimensionality to be off. That's all we need. Um, there is actually something, now that I put it that way, there's something sort of interestingly, sort of philosophically arrogant about aspiring for the unreal, because it's almost like we resent the differential and the dimensional differential. It's like, well, f you dimensional differential. It's all unreal. It's like, no, no. It's just that you're 4 and I'm 16, and it doesn't make me not real just because. And but we can play, like we do have in our life these experience of of playing with these dimensional differentials. Um, and I think the more, like, to bring it to the practical, the really pragmatic idea of just living in the world and writing and doing research and writing books and making documentaries and so forth. Uh, it is always the filmmaker who in some way recognizes this play with the inaccessible higher dimensional that always ends up doing their work better. Have you ever seen Grizzly Man by Herzog? There's the final. So the premise of it is there's this guy who thinks he goes to live with grizzly bears. He kind of thinks he can communicate with them and sort of be of their society. I don't know if he ever thinks of himself as a bear, but he believes that this is possible, and he brings a camcorder and he documents his life. And as you can imagine, though, he is killed by a grizzly bear at some point, but it's recorded, like, because he dropped the camera presumably, and it kept recording while he was being eaten alive. And so Herzog writes, the found footage of this, but also does interviews with people who knew. And there's one scene in which, and this is very graphic novelist, I think, of Herzog. The whole scene is him with headphones on, connected to the camcorder, pressing play, and it's just a quiet. But the family of the guy are like sitting on a couch in their living room, and he's just listening. And this is the thing. This is the moment of his death. He takes it off and says, "Never, ever listen to this, ever." Something like that. And it's chilling. It is. He has just harnessed my entire intelligence, my entire being, to play that recording in my mind. And he has done that to every single person who got to that moment in the film, who was sort of in it. That's next level. That's next level. Not because he has gone to a higher dimension. We're all in it together. It's that he has started to figure out weird kind of like billiard ball bank shots, like creative bank shots, to kind of momentarily go into these other dimensions and come back. And I don't know how to put it. It's.
I think there are a couple of places where, at least from when I was reading you did something like this for me, and I have a few distinct places in mind. One of the things you were talking about earlier was the sort of unique act of exclusion that occurred against the Chinese language, and you described this sort of Technolinguistic Chinese Exclusion Act, and I found some of the passages you use and the deployment of phrases just really also kind of chilling in a sense. You describe how the Chinese script had to be marked as this abject form and was so intolerable that it needed to be banished from ontology itself. And that's like one of those phrases that for me is, you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. And you do this in a lot of other places as well. And I'm trying to decide which direction I want to go here. I have so many questions coming from this, but one of them is understanding when it comes to the offering your reader something to project on, how you think about your situatedness as an historian in the context of your writing. When I was reading your two books, my last point of reference was I guess, the last history book I read about China, which was Vogel's biography of Deng Xiaoping. And I kind of noticed this difference between how you two approach breaking the fourth wall, as it were, because a lot of Vogel, he's just telling you the history, he's telling you about Deng Xiaoping, and then later, much later in the book, I think this is probably around where he's talking about Tiananmen and Deng's role in the whole thing, he finally kind of comes forward and says, I, as a historian, have to like make a comment about the way in which we should interpret and understand these events. And you did this in a kind of different way, where you almost, in the introduction to the Chinese typewriter, really come out swinging. And I found both approaches really powerful in different ways. Like the way you do it, you generate this kind of momentary destabilization of the conceptual algorithm you illustrate, by which we come to understand what it means to be a typewriter. And then you're immediately like, hold on a minute, I destabilize this for you, but that alone, that's like not enough. You have to engage in this continual kind of Sisyphean process of continuing to destabilize the concepts by which we've come to understand the world and recognize them as accidents of history and not a priori things that are sort of real in a sense. I guess I'm just kind of wondering how you like understand yourself in that context and how you think about and make decisions about when to be the historian speaking directly to your reader.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the first, I think it'd be fair to say, as a general rule, different readers have different views, but I think that what I'm about to say, it addresses most nonfiction history readers per se, perhaps, would be there's a cost. Like you're paying out of the account when you go that route. I've come to start talking to my students and colleagues that this idea that, you know, when you crack open a book, like you as the author, you've got like $1,000 of goodwill in this account with your reader. There are very few jerk readers that are just like, from the moment they open the book. And that bank account can go up. You can make decisions as author that enhance that and augment it, and then you can go bankrupt. You can really pay it down. And I think there are many ways of doing that, but one of them definitely is self-indulgence. You know, the self-indulgence is, let me just spend your time. How about that? How about I just spend your time for you? You're not going to get anything out of it. This is just something, it's my book. I get to do it. It's my party, and I can cry if I want to, and you just have to watch me. Um, a reader will follow you for that, even if it isn't productive. Sometimes, up to a point. And so, when the first thing is that when I do think very cautiously about those moments, and I definitely have more of those moments that are in the, I always call it a cut kept file, in my cut kept file than in the actual final book in everything I ever write. So you want to be very selective with that. And I do think that it needs to be. So what I tried to do in those passages, that particular set in Typewriter, was uh, invite the reader into this instability. And then as soon as they walk in the door, they see me, and I'm like sitting there with a slice of birthday cake, being like, hey, welcome to the party. I also close my eyes and see this picture. I am not above it, behind it, before it, post it. Um, but I know, you know, like, just because I'm telling you, hey, you're a fish in an aquarium, I am a fish in the aquarium swimming right alongside you. All I want to say is like, hey, you know, have you noticed that we're in an aquarium? And so in that case, it was designed to do something, because, you know, and I had that little speech. It was a little bit too much, maybe, but the whole thing about, you know, just sort of dragging it back from the edge of taken for grantedness, et cetera, and stuff like that. Um, but I can't stand holier than thou writers. I cannot stand holier than thou people. I don't care what, I don't care anything. If someone is holier than thou, it just it just really, 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 really bothers me. Uh, it's and so what I wanted to make sure I did there was not do a sort of dead poet society. I have already achieved enlightenment. Won't you join me? Won't you, break the wall, Pink Floyd style, and join me past the wall because I'm here? And it's that's not actually what we're doing. We No one is outside the soundstage, um, and but we've got to talk about the soundstage. We've got to talk about it, and so I think in that moment, if counterintuitively, if had I don't know, maybe I could have pulled it off in a different rhetorical way, but uh, to just clinically move through the constructedness of this, and never having mentioned myself as part of the story, ran the risk of indirectly suggesting my transcendence of it as the author, which I think actually happens more than authors realize, that by leaving themselves out, they in fact implicitly claim their transcendence of it. And I, for one, am so much. This comes back to the story at my undergraduate when, leading feminist thinker says, "Yeah, kid just turned one, and now I'm really struggling with the question of like that." To me, actually doesn't explode. It enhances, it augments, it magnifies everything we talked about in the class, and every reading we did is when there is no one in the room is claiming transcendence of something in any way, shape, or form.
You're saying this is hard, and I'm in there with you.
This is hard. This is hard. We have real empirical reason to understand that uh, this is made. This is. It might be a 500-year construction, but or a 200-year, uh, and it. What makes it so hard is because we're in it. We're mapping it from its interior. We are not. There is no, you know, Archimedean point. Everything the way we write about, just because of the technology by which the language at our disposal, everything seems as if we're standing outside of it, describing its shape. But we know we're inside the bowels of it, trying to map out the contours of it as if we were able to look at it objectively or look at it from a distance. But we know that that's not the case. But that it doesn't mean, and I can't remember if I write about this in the book or not, but is I often think of this spectrum of reactions to that moment. One is the retreat to realism, the retreat to essentialism, which is, and then the one is sort of a retreat in the direction, which is a form of escapism, of saying, that again to demonstrate empirical the constructedness of something is in somehow to in some deep way destabilize it or kind of wave a magic wand at it. And what I admire most, and what I constantly fail and fail and fail and fail and fail, but then try to pick myself back up to be, is just in this super uncomfortable place in between those poles. And I think that that was a. I think that is. There are moments when it's just easier to just say it. Um, there's a incredible book, and I'm forgetting the title of it, but it's I believe it's an anthropologist writing on a neography, an invented script, a new script from I think the mid 20th century in a part of Southeast Asia, and I'm blanking on every detail of this, but it's the story of this person who understands himself as being spoken to by God, and then having it written, and sort of developing this writing system for his community, et cetera, et cetera. And the the tone of it is sort of historical, linguistic, anthropological. And then there's this passage, I think, at the end of the book where it's a little bit like this vocal moment. It's like, you know, I just have to say, I don't like the person basically said, I don't believe that this comes from God. Like he just say, like he comes out for a moment and is, he doesn't say, I think the person's insane. He doesn't say, therefore we, that he just for some reason decided to just share something in incredibly exquisite prose. I have to find, if I find the book, I'll have to send you the title so it make more sense. But when I read a passage like that, it's just like, why don't more authors do this? They don't have to go on for at length. It and it doesn't undermine. It doesn't undermine the argument. It doesn't undermine everything we've learned. It still leaves a space for me to believe that it comes from God. If I, if that's, and it's still, the book is still the book. Um, that I do think there are moments in which you save a lot of time as a writer to situate it in that way. And so, but there are many, many other cases that just like, okay, cut that. That's indulgent. Cut that, cut that, cut that. The best editing I've ever done was when, it sounds strange to say, but like when my entire family had COVID and we were under quarantine for like a month and a half. Uh, and I literally had like 20 minutes of work that I could do a day. I was sitting there. The beginning of that experience was quite scary because it started out with our kids, but everything turned out to be fine. And then it swept through the rest of us, but it was just, it wasn't physically in any way threatening. But then, of course, had no childcare, no school, no nothing, and so we were just there um, and full time, just finding something to occupy the kids' time when we couldn't go anywhere. And so after, it would just be after they go to bed and before one of them would wake up again. It was like these chunks of 20 minutes, and I just sat down with the Chinese computer. This is the final stage of that, and I was so annoyed at not all of it, but about 10% of my words. I was like imagining being a dad whose whole family has COVID, who wants to read this book called The Chinese Computer, and why is the author, and you got a bank account with me, I trust you, I'm ready to go on this journey, and you keep indulging yourself with this word, this sentence, or this thing. It's just like, and so I ended up cutting about 10% of the manuscript, and in my view, nothing was lost because it was just this sense of uh, writing for someone who is in that situation, who wants to get through this thing, but only has about 20 minutes at a time to do so. And it was some of the best editing and most laser focused editing I've ever done. And a lot of things that got taken out were little insertions of self.
That seems really valuable. Before I keep pestering you with questions, I want to be mindful of your time because I realize, I guess I'm just realizing we're a bit over the time that I had you booked for. How are we doing on time?
I think maybe one more question would be good, and then I need to jump off if that's okay.
Of course, yeah. Okay, now I need to pick between the many questions I have left. There's so many things in the Chinese computer that I wanted to kind of get into, but maybe one thing I'm kind of wondering about is at this point where we were sort of talking earlier about the possibility as a sort of pragmatic thing of a sequel in the Chinese typewriter series, as it were. But it sounded like to me, and it sounds like these two books were kind of the original scope of what you were thinking made sense as like the complete thing. I guess I'm wondering at this point in time, having completed the Chinese typewriter and the Chinese computer, what's your relationship to like the process of the work, where you are with it? Where do you feel you are with all of this? Do you feel finished in any sense? Where do you think you are with it?
Um, I think I think I came to do what I wanted to do with this. I do feel that although the subject matter is of course still fascinating to me, um, probably the way I often put it with problems is that you never resolve a problem. It turns out you just kind of, it loses its grip on your heart. It becomes something that is Have you ever bought? You wear glasses, so have you ever bought? When's the last time you bought a new pair of glasses? The second you buy a new pair of glasses, your old glasses suddenly look so much older.
They do.
The calcium deposits, or the like, you, it's just so weird. But when you're wearing them on a day to day basis, even if they're worn and weathered, they still feel living and present and here, like you're in the same space time with them. But then the second you bring that new pair home and it begins to become part of your cybernetic organism being, you see it in the drawer, and it looks like it's in a different space time. It's like it belongs to someone else, and you kind of, it's hard to remember wearing it every day, and you see it. And I think there's something of it doesn't disappear. Is what I'm saying. It's the same thing with with problems. Is they kind of look like these glasses you've worn for 5 years and now you don't wear anymore. Um, and I suspect that the shape of the problem, as I've thought through it for these last two books, um, is losing its grip on me. But I'm drifting into a new area. Um, I do think language will show up again. I do think that uh, transnational questions will show up again. I do think that, but I think that they will either, if they end up looking similar, they will mask an actual discontinuity, and um, if they if everything looks completely different from whatever's next, it'll mask a continuity. So I tend to think of the weird nonlinear continuity of a dream. Um, we have one of these dreams where, okay, you try to describe it to someone, you're like, okay, so I was walking down the street and I turned around and then there was a rabbit there, and yeah, the rabbit was my dad, and move on. And it's like, on the surface of it, in mathematical terms, that would be a sharp edge, that would be a non-contiguous curve. But you know and the way it feels is that this was just, there was never a moment in which I've broken, you can still do calculus on this curve. It's still okay. And the same thing, that curve is the problem. And then the rabbit turned out to be my dad, is like, one book's about ethnic classification, another book's about typewriters, the other book is about what it's about. And it's like, they're in different sections of the library, they're in different orals reading lists, they're in different classes if they're taught. Different people think they're relevant to them if they pick it up or do not pick it up. Uh, and so I don't know at this point whether or not it'll be something abrupt, like the rabbit was my dad kind of a thing, or if it will be just like the other thing that happens in dreams all the time, is that the rabbit was still there, but it wasn't like something had changed. I'm saying, like, there are these in which everything seemed to be the same, but I could feel that it's different. There is a possibility of a case study, settling upon a case study that's along those lines. I mean, the book that I'm writing and in the final stages of as we speak is a book about disappearance. It is focused on, um, it's called How We Disappear. That's the working title. It's about disintegration and ruin and entropy and rot and extinction um, and uh, obsolescence and bit flips and uh, just all the words and then some that we use to talk about information falling out of formation. Um, and so that is an attempt, and that actually was where all of this came from. The um, typewriter and computer were, I sometimes use this metaphor and it comes across in the wrong way, but I know it's true. Um, uh, we are smarter than ourselves. Like, you can have a thought that is more advanced than you are ready for. I mean, we know this all the time. I talk to my 5-year-old and he's saying stuff that he's saying and thinking things he's not prepared to say and think. Just And the same thing is true as whereas we're adults. It sounds egotistical to say like, wow, I had like an incredibly sophisticated idea that I am not intelligent enough to do. It's like, okay, Tom. Like, yes, we all know you're smart. Stop fishing for compliment. It's just like it's just a basic fact of life. And the metaphor that I often use is excavation. I think this is empirically true, but if not, even if it's not, it makes a good story. Is that they've known where the tomb complex of Qianshi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, has been for a very long time. And they know, like archaeologists know where things are sometimes, and they leave it in the ground. Why do they leave it in the ground? Because their tech is not yet good enough to open it. People have made decisions saying, like, basically, that's the same way I think as writers, as researchers, all of us, I am not yet smart enough to dig this up. Because if I dig it up now, it's going to just sort of turn to dust. It's just like, I'm not going to capture it. I'm not going to preserve it. Yes, I'll finish it. I'll write it, but I will have destroyed it in the process, completely destroyed it. So just leave it in the ground. But while you're leaving it in the ground, what do? You excavate other sites that you are ready to excavate. You excavate, you prepare, you do preparation digs, you do typewriter and computer were preparation digs for the book that I'm writing now, which I still am very, very, very worried that I'm not smart enough to dig up. And I kind of just have to do it and not, sabotage myself. But this is true of lots of people, lots of books that I admire. If you read the acknowledgments or read the preface, you'll discover that they were, I'm not ready for this other book. I'm going to write this one first. Seeing like a state. Read Seeing Like a State again. In the preface, he basically says, like, there's this other thing I wanted to work on, but I needed to write this one first as like a base camp to the ascent up the mountain. Like, I'm not ready to climb the mountain yet. And my understanding is that the mountain for him was the art of being ungoverned. He wanted to write the Zomia book, but I guess maybe if I would put it this way, before I write the Zomia book, I've got to write everybody else. Like how is everyone else simplified and state simplified and high modernized, etc. But in order to get to this place that imagines an ungoverned space, but everyone, of course, loves thinks, love or hate, they think with that book all the time. And so people can rewrite in their minds what the career was. Be like, that was James Scott's like K2 or whatever the heck the name is. That was the climb up to the top of the mountain, when from his perspective it was not. And it's I don't know what's going to happen.
Well, I wish you strength and everything you need for the rest of the ascent up this mountain. And I guess I just want to end by saying I'm a huge admirer of your work. I want to thank you for doing it and for being so generous with your time today. It was wonderful speaking with you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you also for just your questions, and I haven't heard them before, and so I really appreciate that very much. I know how hard it is to ask questions where the person answering isn't just thankful for just being able to talk about their stuff, but is actually appreciative of, like, yeah, okay, this is a chance to actually think about something. So thank you for that.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to my guest, Tom Mullaney. If you like this, I hope you'll take a second and share it with somebody else. And I will see you in the next episode.